Good morning. This is chapter 23 continuing, and this will be an entire video on Teddy Roosevelt, his biography, and the man. Teddy Roosevelt is a huge figure. He dominates for decades, so we have to spend a lot of time on him, and then we'll probably have another one with the 1912 election and Woodrow Wilson, who is also in that chapter. So there will be several videos in this series. Teddy Roosevelt, I call the poster boy for the reform movement. He's the poster boy for the progressive movement. The first slides that we are starting with are number 30, and you can see Teddy Roosevelt was chosen to be on Mount Rushmore, the only kind of contemporary president put on Mount Rushmore. Question you have to ask is, should he have been chosen? He's a very complicated figure, a very big figure in American history, a lot of pros and cons with Teddy Roosevelt. Is he a progressive? Is he a conservative? Both, actually, yes and no. There's no clear answers in history. There's no black and white. The next slide is Teddy Roosevelt not shooting a bear. You all know Teddy Roosevelt because most of you had a teddy bear when you were little. And the story went Teddy Roosevelt was a big hunting guy, and he was out there, and there's several versions of this. The version I kind of like better is that they shot a bear. They found out it was a mother bear that had a young cub, and of course the people with him said, shoot the cub, it can't survive. Teddy Roosevelt said, no, let's take it back with us, and he did. He gave it to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., and it became a big sensation. And at that point, they started making stuffed teddy bears. So all of us, I had a stuffed teddy bear. I'm sure most of you did too. That's why they're called teddy bears instead of Joe Bears or something else. From Lincoln to 1900, we have a series of mediocre presidents. Most of us cannot remember more than one name in there, or even if that much. They were very similar policies, nothing stands out until 1900, 1901, and you get Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt as a man, as a president, I spend a lot of time on him because he's a good insight into his chronological period, into the early 1900s. He is unusual. He doesn't fit the stereotypes, conservative and liberal. He's a very, very wealthy man, one of our three wealthiest presidents, who championed the little man, who championed the poor. And again, my criteria is not how much wealth you have, but what do you know about the average person's life, which we'll examine with Teddy Roosevelt. Very gifted, a good writer, a great speaker, very gifted politician, a good historian, and a military guy. So multi-talented in many, many ways. Came from a very, very rich New York City family. The family was in the glass business. So, of course, what are they building these skyscrapers out of in the early 1900s? There's tons and tons of windows with tons and tons of glass. So the family is making a lot of money. The father was from New York City. He had married a Southerner. His wife was a Southerner, I believe from Georgia, but I'm not sure. Dad, on the other hand, was very socially active. He practiced, not only taught about, but practiced the gospel of wealth. He founded a children's aid society for orphan children in the ghetto. He was involved with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Natural History Museum. He fostered slum kids. And not only did he pay and financially support them, most Sundays he would go down to the children's shelter, bring them presents, read books to them, have actual interaction with poor orphans from the ghettos. He also brought his children there. So very young, Teddy Roosevelt has contact with very poor children. This is very rare for a wealthy child at the time. Unfortunately, the father, who was beloved by everybody and kind of the head of the whole family, everybody adored him, he dies of cancer when Teddy Roosevelt is a college freshman. And Teddy Roosevelt is just completely thrown by this. 2,000 people attended the funeral of his father, including a number of the little orphans that he had helped sponsor. No one ever had a bad word to say about Roosevelt Sr. Teddy had an older sister. who was crippled from birth, not very attractive person, which was a huge thing for women at that time, but clearly the smartest one in the family, much smarter than Teddy was. Everybody acknowledged this. He also was fifth cousins with Franklin Roosevelt. So the Roosevelts are a large, extended, very wealthy family. Teddy Roosevelt's brother's daughter, his niece, marries Franklin Roosevelt later. So if you look at those slides, slide number 33, I think, is the image I always have of Teddy Roosevelt in my head. The wall-to-wall grin, the teeth. This is a guy, you can tell from the photograph, he's a powerhouse, he has a lot of energy, and he is unrelentingly positive about things. On the other hand, if you look at the next slide, this is what he started out as. Slide number 34 is Teddy Roosevelt at about 7 or 8 years old. He was a very sickly, severe asthmatic as a child, had very weak eyesight, was not a healthy physical specimen. In fact, his family assumed he was going to die in childhood. He didn't. About the age of 12, his dad puts together a home gym in their basement, which was very progressive for the time, and starts challenging the son. You can improve. As the father said, you must make your body. So he started exercising, he started lifting weights. He really polished this off when he went west to the Dakotas. But by the time he goes to college, he is 5'8", never a tall guy, but about 200 pounds solid muscle, which you can see in that photograph. This is a guy who is built like an ox. Twice, when he went to Harvard, he was twice national middleweight champion. So he becomes a physical specimen through his own efforts. Never did correct his eyesight, of course. Always wore glasses and always carried half a dozen pair in case he broke one. But in terms of muscle power, he turned into an outstanding specimen. Doctors had said, avoid exercise. His father said, you go in and exercise. So part of this affects, I think, his psychology. I got fascinated with Teddy Roosevelt about 2-3 years ago, and I read a whole lot of books about him. And one of them is Youthful Teddy Roosevelt. And I think the author is right in saying that Teddy Roosevelt, because of his own biography, saw life as a battle in many ways, and that you can fight your way through, that problems are solvable. Look what I did with my own life. I created a better person. The downside of that is he expects everybody else to do that as well. So there's pro and con with that. Education, of course, he had private tutors. At Harvard, he had his own private room, which was very rare. He gets a law degree. He did not graduate at the top of his class, but pretty close, 21 out of about 200. Law bores Teddy Roosevelt. It's not exciting for him. Other things he was much more interested in. From childhood, he was always interested in the outdoors, all of his life, particularly nature study. They had their own estate up on the Hudson River in upstate New York, where he had the run of the place. He spent a lot of time in the woods, and he would collect different things, and he had a whole little shelf built for his nature shelf, he called it. Pretty soon he was charging neighborhood kids a dime to come and look at his natural history collection. His uncle is the outstanding #1 ichthyologist in America. Ichthyologist studies fish, so there's a strong strain of natural history in the family. At 10 years old, Teddy Roosevelt read Darwin cover to cover. So here's a very precocious kid. His specialty in nature was birds. He became a world expert on birds. And when he finally went to Britain, early in his government career, he got off the boat. He didn't ask to see the Queen or the Prime Minister. He said, bring me a bird expert. I want to go birding in Britain. They got him one. He went out birding for 2 days with the guy. The guy was interviewed later by the British papers, and I'm quoting from the article. Colonel Roosevelt not only knows more about American birds than I did, of course, but more about British birds as well. So he is a world authority on birds. All of his life, which started in his youth, first thing he did when he got up in the morning is walk 3 miles a day. He would pick a direction and take off, walk for 3 miles, come back, return the same direction. No matter what was in the way, you went through it, around it, over it, under it. So if you you're going north today and there's a stream, you cross the stream. If there's a hill, you climb the hill. If there's a bridge, you go over the bridge. Whatever obstacle was there, you stay on your course. Later on, he dragged his kids to go with him, visitors who came to visit him, even as president. He did this as president, too, first thing every morning, had to go walking with Teddy Roosevelt. And there is this famous story about a French ambassador who comes all decked out from, the French government, and he's come to talk some diplomatic terms with Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt says, no, we have to go walking first. I do walking before I do anything else. So the poor guy in his nice outfit and his white gloves, he goes walking with Teddy Roosevelt. They pick a direction, and they get to, in Washington, D.C., there's a good-sized creek, Rock Creek. So they get to the creek, Teddy and the Frenchman stops and said, okay, we can go. No, we're going through the creek. So Teddy Roosevelt strips naked, swims across the creek, turns around, come on, let's go. Well, he's the president. You can't turn him down. So the Frenchman takes off his clothes and starts across the creek. And Teddy looks at him and says, why do you have your gloves on? He stripped naked except for his white elbow-length gloves, which was the fashion at the time. And the Frenchman turned to Teddy and said, one never knows when one might meet ladies. So they got across the creek. They went a little further. They came back, put their clothes back on, and went back to the White House and had a nice diplomatic meeting. So there are so many Teddy Roosevelt stories. You could go on for weeks talking about Teddy Roosevelt stories, but just some few that give you a caption. I want you to get an idea of this guy's personality. Does character make a difference in a president? Absolutely. And Teddy Roosevelt is the poster boy for this. He is clearly hyperactive. He is a ball of energy. His motto, and I'm quoting Teddy here, is a man's duty is to work, to fight, and to breed. And he did all three. As vice president with McKinley, his vice presidential campaign, he was put on to balance the ticket. He travels 20,000 miles, gives close to 700 speeches. Again, these are live speeches with no amplification, to over 3 million people personally. So this is a whole different world than what we know today. Huge appetite. He ate 3 big meals a day. And one of his aides was quoted as saying, I would say he ate twice as much as the average man easily. Personally wrote answers during his lifetime, and we have them, wrote personal responses to about 150,000 letters that were written to him at various times. So the next time you have to write a thank you note to your grandma, don't complain. Think about writing 150,000 letters. He was observed playing 91 tennis games in one day. There were witnesses. As New York governor, he gave 102 live speeches in 1 week, and these are not 10-minute speeches. These are long speeches at the time. 1903, he went on a Western tour in 8 weeks. He went 14,000 miles by train, stopped at 150 towns, and well over 300 speeches. So the guy has nothing but energy. He is an energizer rabbit. Also, I would say a genius intellect. He is one of the few presidents we've had that clearly genius IQ. Thomas Jefferson, probably another one, and you'll never think of it. But despite all his faults, Bill Clinton, probably very high IQ. Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar as well. Teddy Roosevelt, no question about it. He had an encyclopedic mind, always carried a book with him, read, and I'm not making this up because, again, there are witnesses to this, 1 to 3 books a day. Clearly, he had figured out how to do speed reading. But not just skimming. He read these books. He had almost total recall. He was witnessed quoting from books. If you asked him 6 months later, what did Kant say about such and such, he could spin it off. He remembered it. He actually read this stuff. Um, Total recall most of his life. As an older man, he could recall in his youth when he was in Dakota, he could recall the names of the dogs and the horses on the ranch that he stayed at. Very quick study. He would suck experts dry. He liked to talk to professors and experts and people who knew things. He wrote himself in his lifetime. Remember, he's a full-time politician as well. He wrote 23 books. The first was published when he was 18 years old. It was a naturalist book on birds. One of his books on the U.S. Navy, development of the U.S. Navy, is still used today as a textbook in the U.S. Naval College. Fluent in French and German, because he had studied in Germany as well. Like Germany, he was not around in World War II, not active in World War II, but absolutely a genius, hyperactive genius, also a very human president. He's, again, a friend of his. He's the only lovable president America has ever had. And if you liked him, Teddy Roosevelt was very lovable. If you scroll down there, you can see his family photo in slide number 41. He had a whole mess of kids, something like 6 kids. They are all over the White House. It's not often that we have little kids in the White House. The Kennedys were loved because they had little kids in the White House. So you have kids, you had the donkeys, you had the ponies, you had the dogs, you had the cats, you had the goats, you had the chickens. People love this stuff. And Teddy would get out, he would run, he would wrestle with his kids, he'd play games on the lawn with them. He was totally incapable of hiding any of his emotions. If you saw him, you immediately knew what he was thinking. He lived with and worked with logging men. He worked with cowboys. He worked with average people early in his life. He was wonderful with reporters and the press. He could get along with almost anybody and did very well with them. And there is a famous story once where a group of senators come to visit Teddy Roosevelt at the White House, and they get out and they had a carriage that was driven by a black man. And Teddy Roosevelt steps out on the White House steps, walks down to meet the senators, walks right past the 5 or 6 senators up to the black guy, the carriage driver, and says, "Hello, I've never met you. What's your name? Tell me about yourself." Talk to the carriage driver for 15, 20 minutes while these very important senators are standing around waiting for the president. He didn't do this for effect. He was actually interested in the guy and kept correspondence with him later, by the way. So Teddy Roosevelt is just a people person, and people love that. Totally fearless, not only in battle, but throughout his life. He had learned as a child, as a very shy, timid child, to overcome that. And he wrote something that I keep in my mind fairly often when I'm terrified of stuff. This is Teddy Roosevelt. There were all kinds of things I was afraid of at first, but by acting as if I was not afraid, I gradually ceased to be afraid. So he had trained himself to become fearless. He didn't start out that way. 40 years old, not a young man. He's on a hunting trip. They are hunting a mountain lion that had killed some cattle. The dogs tree the mountain lion, and one of the guys drags out his rifle. He's going to shoot it down. Teddy Roosevelt says, no, 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 that's not very sporting. Teddy Roosevelt, there were witnesses to this. He's 40 years old, right? Takes a knife between his teeth, holds it between his teeth, climbs the tree, knifes the mountain lion to death, and brings it down. So, you have to wonder at this guy. Is he crazy or is he incredibly admirable? Maybe both. There was an accident with another carriage he was riding in, and his leg became infected. It hit his upper leg, his thigh, and there was an abscess there. And the doctor said, look, we have to lance this. We have to get the pus and the infection out, or it's going to spread and it's not going to be very good. And he said, okay, yeah, obviously. And they, come into the White House. They set up their table and they say, okay, here's some anesthetic so you don't feel it. He said, no, no anesthetic. So they cut open his thigh without any anesthetic. He never flinches, he never says a sound. They drain the pus, they sew it back up again, and the wound healed itself. Not what I would do, actually. The downside of Teddy, he has many admirable traits. The negative traits that he has is he is a total, no question, egotist, egocentric to a fault, very dominant character, very charismatic. But as one of his acquaintances says, he is drunk with himself. He, again, from his childhood, because they thought he was going to die, he's a very rich kid. When he wanted something, it was immediately brought. So it's pretty clear Teddy Roosevelt did think the world revolved around him. That's how he spent his childhood, doing that. He fell in love with a girl in college, and she turned him down. He proposed 3 times. She turned him down. Nope, not doing this. And he said to a friend, she won't have me, but I will have her. And he pursued her for over a year. He badgered her. She finally agreed to marry him. The kind of guy who will finish your sentences for you. Again, he's got a very quick mind. His own son said of Teddy Roosevelt, this is his son talking, he wants to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral, always the center of attention. In college, he would constantly debate with his professors in the middle of class. Sometimes this is a good thing, sometimes it drives you crazy. Finally, getting real sick of this, one of his professors turned around and said, see here, Roosevelt, I'm running this course. You're not teaching the course. And after that, he finally shut up. Sound familiar? He actually did believe he could do things better than anyone else and was right most of the time. He was the smartest guy in the room most of the time. Loved by most of the people who had contact with him, hated by some because he is a total egotist. One of his aides said to a newspaper, if we were crossing Brooklyn Bridge and Teddy told me to jump in the river, I would jump and not ask why. People just adored Teddy Roosevelt. He is a lovable, likable person. So he gets a Harvard law degree. The law was very boring to Teddy. He decides, I like politics. It's much more exciting, particularly in New York City. A lot of corruption. Those political bosses were running the city. Local boss says, okay, let's get this guy here. He's got a lot of money. He can contribute to the party. And they run him as a state representative in New York State at 23 years old. They figure he's only 23, he's inexperienced, we can use his money and we can manipulate him any way we want. Wrong. He can't be bribed because he's wealthy, and he can't be manipulated because he's Teddy Roosevelt. He doesn't take instructions from anybody. First thing he does when he's elected representative in the New York Assembly is turn around and attack the corruption, not only the Democrats, but his own people that put him in as well. So at the age of 25, he's already a well-known figure in New York State. He attends the National Republican Convention. He becomes a candidate for mayor at 27 years old. He didn't win that, but at the age of 36, he is New York City police captain for 2 years. And as head of the police, he walked the beats. He got out on the streets, including all-night walks, to see what was going on in the city and shut down a lot of the police corruption. At the age of 38, he's appointed Assistant Secretary to the Navy in Washington. At 40, he's elected as New York governor, as a reform progressive governor. And he is put on the vice presidential ticket for the same reason they put him on in his first political job as representative. He's too active. As governor of New York, he starts rooting out corruption. He starts jailing these guys who helped put him in office, and they put him on as vice presidential candidate to get him out of New York. Get this guy in Washington so he leaves us alone. He is the first president from an urban area who was elected who came from an urban area. He was vice president. McKinley is assassinated a year after. 1901, Teddy Roosevelt is now president. But importantly, he has 20 years of all kinds of political experience before he becomes president. So, how much experience is too much? How much is too little? We are finding out in contemporary history some experience is a good thing, none is not a good thing, too much can be a good thing, can be a bad thing too. As a public figure, he was absolutely incorruptible. Not only could you not bribe him, you couldn't even give him a gift. So, backtracking a little bit, 25 years old, his young wife, who he badgered into marrying him, is pregnant. She dies in childbirth. 11 hours before she died, his mother dies of typhoid fever in the same house. So Teddy Roosevelt is running from one bed to the other. His mother and his wife die the same day in the same house. The baby survived, but Teddy basically fell apart. Most of us would. He said, "The light has gone out of my life." He was completely unmoored by this. He doesn't want to be in New York. He can't stand living in that house. He leaves the baby with his trusted sister for a couple of years, and he goes to North Dakota, where the Roosevelt family has a very large ranch with about 5,000 head of cattle. This was a financial investment. They had somebody else running it. Teddy Roosevelt is a total greenhorn. He's never been west at this point. He knows how to ride a horse because everybody knew how to ride a horse then, but he has never seen a cow except as a steak on a plate. So he shows up. Mr. Roosevelt, here's the ranch house for you. He says, no, don't tell anybody. I want to live as a cowboy. Hire me as a hired hand, as a cowboy. And he bunks in the bunkhouse with the other cowboys at $1 a day. Total greenhorn. He could ride, but he knew nothing about cattle. And they nicknamed him immediately Mr. Hasten Forward because he would get out there when they're herding cattle and say, "Hasten forward there, you cattle, line up here, move along there." And he became Mr. Hasten Forward. They teased him. They teased him about his Coke bottle eyeglasses. They teased him unmercifully for about 2 months until Teddy Roosevelt got sick of it, turned around, picked the biggest, toughest cowboy on the ranch, beat the crap out of him. Remember, he's a former wrestler. At that point, they left him alone. Within 6 months, he is the best cowboy on the place. He learned to rope, he learned to ride, he learned to deal with cattle. He often rode 100 miles a day. He wore out 4 and 5 horses a day. There were times during the roundup where they would work 40 hours straight and go through half a dozen horses because you couldn't stop the work. Teddy Roosevelt turned out to be the best hand on the ranch, and there again are witnesses to this. At 400 yards, one day when he's hunting out in Dakota, with a single shot, he killed 2 buck deer who happened to be lined up one in back of the other. With 2 men in Dakota, he tracked 3 horse thieves that had stolen some horses from the ranch. He tracked them 45 miles on foot in 2 days. Over 2 days, they walked 45 miles. They did not sleep. They actually caught the guys who weren't expecting it, brought them back 300 miles. They were taken to court, they were tried, and they were hung. So Teddy Roosevelt becomes a real cowboy. He gets his life back together. After 2 years, he returns to New York City. He remarries. He goes back into politics. This is when he's nominated for governor and eventually for vice presidential candidate. When McKinley is shot and dies, not of the gunshot wound, but of infection later, all of a sudden, quote unquote, that damn cowboy is now president. And nobody knows what to expect, except, of course, the New York delegation. They knew him in New York. No one knew him outside of New York. So the next video will be Teddy Roosevelt as president, as progressive.